All right, so we're looking at mostly Mesopotamia, Egypt, the Hebrews, when we talk about what's going to be on the test. You do have notes already, and you can refer to those notes, but this will help you just know a little bit more specifically what will be on the test. So the Hebrews settled between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River Valley. This area was part of the Fertile Crescent in Southwest Asia. Um, the Phoenicians settled along the Mediterranean coast and was part of the Fertile Crescent in Southwest Asia. So when we look at the map, and hopefully the map will be good enough to understand where these are. The Phoenicians are on the coast. They were great sailors. They had a purple dye. They had these like snail looking crustacean type things that they would have wash onto their shore on the coast, and they would take those snails out of there and squish them up and make this beautiful purple dye. The people that wanted purple dye were rich people, royalty, people like that. So that purple dye was very valuable, and the Phoenicians became great traders. So they traveled all across the Mediterranean, trading their purple dye. And, basically, when we talk about them creating the alphabet, they created the alphabet to keep good records and to, basically make money. Well, really, there wasn't any money until a little bit later on. We'll talk about money a little bit later on. But, trade goods for other goods, barter, that sort of thing. Nubia was located in the upper southern Nile River in Africa. So the upper Nile is in the south. Egypt's in the north up by the Nile Delta when we look at that map. This is a map of Mesopotamia. And it's really not the best map in the world. This is actually the Fertile Crescent. If you'll notice, you'll have to know where the Fertile Crescent is located. The Fertile Crescent looks like a moon-shaped sort of gray area in here, and that's why they call it the Fertile Crescent. It's sort of like a moon, like a half moon, and it stretches from Mesopotamia and the edge of the Persian Gulf all the way over to Egypt. And the reason they call it the Fertile Crescent is extremely fertile land in this area. You'll notice the rivers, all that make up this part of the Fertile Crescent, very fertile land. A lot of food could be grown here, at least in ancient times. Mesopotamia is located in modern-day Iraq. So the Tigris and Euphrates flow this way, and Sumer is down here at the bottom. It is a city-state. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. All right, Asia Minor became part of the Byzantine Empire, and then the Ottoman Empire, and then Turkey. Mesopotamia became Babylon, which later became Iraq. So Mesopotamia is where modern-day Iraq is located. The Babylonian Empire was located in Mesopotamia. You hear about Babylon a lot in the Bible. Persia, when we talk about Persia a little bit later on, becomes modern-day Iran. We'll talk about Persia probably in the next section, right after India and China. The River Valley civilizations were known as the cradles of civilization. These early civilizations made social, political, economic progress that still influences the world today. Characteristics of the early civilizations. So one of the things that we have to know is that they, all of the early civilizations used hereditary rulers, meaning, so if you were the king, who would more than likely take over after you died? You're the king, who's going to take over? Anyone want to take a guess at that?
Probably the king's son.
Exactly. The king's son. And most of the time in most societies, women had no rights. Even if they were married to the king, a lot of times if the king died and he had no male heir, his son, didn't exist, they would often, their brother would become the king or pharaoh or something along that nature, a nephew, as long as it was a male. Very rare instances, like especially when you talk about the Egyptians, you had Hatshepsut, and you guys probably watched that video on how Hatshepsut took over because her son was very young, and eventually he got mad and took power back from her. But Cleopatra took power only because the Romans wanted the grain supply, and they put her in. Her brother was Pharaoh, and he was like 8 or 9 years old. So, and we'll talk about her a little bit more when we get into the Romans. There's some really great videos on that whole thing when we get there. But very rarely did you have a female. It was always the son. So hereditary rulers, power is passed on from father to son, and it just continues doing that. And once you have that sort of hereditary rule, you can form dynasties where one family rules for many, many, many years. Rigid class systems where slavery was accepted. Slavery existed in ancient times. Slavery was not based on race. It was based on things like debt. If you conquered people in war, often they would become slaves, and not based on race whatsoever. Political, created the world's first city-states and states. In these states, you had centralized governments, and you looked at, in one of the more interesting discussions that we had is that politically you saw the first written law codes, which would be Hammurabi's Code and the Ten Commandments. A lot of people don't look at the Ten Commandments as a law code, but when we get to that, we'll discuss that a little bit more. Economic, metal tools and weapons were developed, increase in agricultural surplus, increased trade along rivers and by the sea. The Phoenicians were the big traders of the ancient world. Development of the world's first cities, developments of the practices of slavery, taking various forms. So here are some things to expand your understanding. A king or a pharaoh is an example of a hereditary ruler. We just said a pharaoh would, once he died, his son would take over for him. It was already, sort of implied that that's what's going to happen. Early centralized governments were often based on religious authorities. Remember, a pharaoh is not only a king, but the people regard him as a god, the living embodiment of a god. When we talk about Mesopotamians, Sumerians, the religious authority was very important. Priests were very important because they, controlled what the people would do, the amount of stuff they would have to bring to the temples or the ziggurats, and they had a lot of power. So religious authority was very important back then. Being a priest or being a pharaoh was very important to people in ancient times. 10 Commandments and the Code of Hammurabi are examples of the first written codes of law. I always separate these, and when we look at them, there's an easy way to do it. The Code of Hammurabi is based on what concept? Does anybody remember that? Any of you guys do the discussion that we had that showed you what Hammurabi's laws were like?
Yes, I did that.
So what type of law code did he have?
He had if you did like a bad thing or something, that you would be put to death or like hurt in a traumatizing way.
That's right. And really, when you think about Code of Hammurabi, this is like biblical stuff. The Old Testament talks about Hammurabi's code and how it was an eye for an eye. And what that means is if you, put out someone's eye, like if you stab somebody in the eye and they lost their eye, then the punishment would fit the crime and you would lose your eye. Okay? So a lot of his, law codes had punishments, and the punishments were very harsh. So when you look at Code of Hammurabi, you have harsh laws and harsh punishments. So if, one of the interesting things is where if the guy builds a house and then the house falls on the owner of the house, then the guy who built the house is sentenced to death. In our society, we really wouldn't do that. I mean, you could sue the guy that built your house, but typically that guy wouldn't be put to death. It would be just, an accident. But Code of Hammurabi has punishments, harsh punishment, eye for an eye. The 10 Commandments are basically guidelines and rules, especially for the Hebrews to follow. And I know many Christians are familiar with the 10 Commandments. Remember, the 10 Commandments have rules like thou shalt not kill, and there's no punishment assigned to them. So that's the way that I look at the Code of Hammurabi and 10 Commandments and separate them. 10 Commandments, basically, you live a certain way, you don't do these things, and really the punishment comes after the fact. After a person dies, they might have to face some sort of punishment for breaking the 10 Commandments, while the Code of Hammurabi is sort of like our law codes today. It's written down. The Code of Hammurabi, if it's the way they looked at it, they put it on pillars and wrote it, and basically it was like this: if you might not know what the law is, but since it's written down, you got to follow that law. That's the way it is today. Law books are probably super thick, and guys who break laws, a lot of times they go, hey man, I didn't even know this was a law. Well, you not knowing it's a law doesn't mean doesn't give you an exemption to break that law. So people have to be really careful. Some of the earliest tools and weapons were made of bronze and iron. Why agricultural surpluses were possible: better tools. The invention of the plow probably came from the Sumerians, and this really helped people grow more food. Irrigation, new ways of digging, irrigation to bring water to crops. And the world's first state. So it starts with a city-state. A city-state is a city and the surrounding area. So like if you had Danville. Danville's the city and the surrounding area is Pittsylvania County. Martinsville's the city and the surrounding area is Henry County. That would be like a city-state. So the city was in the middle and the surrounding area made up the city-state. All right, kingdoms, where a person would take over several city-states, and then he would have a kingdom in one area. And then eventually empires, where you take over several kingdoms and you wind up building an empire. A large stretch of land, many kingdoms, many city-states that you take over and, pretty much build your empire by conquering other people. All right, so one of the things we definitely need to know and definitely be on the test is religion was a real important part of ancient civilizations. Polytheism is the worship and belief in more than one God, practiced by most early civilizations. And then the Hebrews, the belief in one God was practiced by the Hebrews, and this is called monotheism. When we talk about the Hebrews a little bit later, you're going to see the monotheism of Abraham is the foundation of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, religions that changed the world. It's funny because most Muslims and, Jews don't get along with each other, mainly because of Israel, and they basically come from Abraham. Islam is a religion that teaches that Abraham is the father of all Muslim people. Abraham's covenant becomes the basis of Judaism. Abraham is in the Christian Bible as well, in the Old Testament, pretty much the same thing, the sacrifice of his son Isaac, and then God tells him, well, you don't have to sacrifice Isaac. So all these three religions are, basically together as far as the monotheistic religions. All of them believe in one God, okay, the belief in one God. So the Hebrews were the first to become monotheists. So you're going to have to know that on the test. Judaism, the origins of Judaism. Abraham is really the founder of Judaism. Okay, so you have to know he's the founder of Judaism. Moses is an important person in the Jewish faith as well as Christians. Remember, he goes on Mount Sinai and gets the Ten Commandments. He leads the Jews out of slavery from the Egyptians. So you think about Moses, he's very important in the world of Judaism as well. Jerusalem is probably one of the key cities, or the most important city to Jews. It's the holiest city to them. It's also a very holy city to Muslims, Christians too, but not as much. You see, Muhammad died in Jerusalem at the Dome of the Rock, so it becomes very important to them. And the whole Jewish versus Islam sort of, I guess, beef is a good way to look at it, is really because of Jerusalem and access to that city. When we start talking about Islam, you'll see, how important Jerusalem is. And then when we talk about the Crusades, you'll see Christians fighting Muslims for that holy city. Beliefs, traditions, and customs. I tried to say all those words at once real fast. Of Judaism. So Judaism is the belief in one God, and that's monotheistic religion. The body of work that contains the written records and beliefs of the Jews is called the Torah. And then you have the Ten Commandments, is the moral and religious conduct for the Jews. Spread of Judaism, you have exile. The exile was the enslavement and removal of Jews from Palestine after the Babylonian captivity. And diaspora is the Greek word that means scattered. This is when they are scattered around, and they really did spread the religion because they lived outside of their homeland. Okay. All right, so examples of early code of law. Match the code with its source. The answers are already on here for you, so it doesn't really help you. But I always remember that if I'm looking at both of them and I want to know which one's which, if a man committed highway robbery and has been caught, that man shall be put to death. Well, you see, that's a crime and that's a punishment. So I know that has to go with the Code of Hammurabi, okay? And the Ten Commandments, it might seem even easy. Thou shalt not steal. So you're not supposed to steal. There's no punishment listed with that. So that has to be a Ten Commandment. Most people are familiar with the Ten Commandments through Christianity as well. But the Ten Commandments say, thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet anything that is thy neighbor's. Obviously, that's also a Ten Commandment. No punishment for coveting the neighbor. But at the same time, still, no punishment, but it gives you, something you're not supposed to do. So that would be a Ten Commandment. If a free man has destroyed the eye of a member of aristocracy, they shall destroy his eye. So an eye for an eye is what Code of Hammurabi is really all about. So Code of Hammurabi would go there. All right, this one's important. Match the form of language and writing with their early beginnings. So the earliest written symbols are going to be 4 pictograms, just pictures of what would represent a thing or sound. Then you have Egypt and hieroglyphs and hieroglyphics. Pictures type writing that represent sounds. Sumerians used cuneiform. And then the Phoenicians, they created the alphabet. So the phonetic alphabet, excuse me, whenever I think about the Phoenicians and phonetic alphabet, there used to be this program that helped kids learn how to read, and it was called Hooked on Phonics, okay? And it helped you learn how to read. Well, phonics comes from the word Phoenicians, okay? Because the Phoenicians created the alphabet. So Hooked on Phonics is sort of like saying, I'm hooked on phonics. It's going to help me learn how to read the alphabet and learn words. So Phoenicians created the modern alphabet that, the Greeks used and that we use today. All right. And that's going to end that review. I did want to go over one more thing real quickly because there is some confusion about how to use these PowerPoints. And so let me find a good place to start here. All right, so when I look at this, let's say I just started at the beginning or I start right here. This PowerPoint basically is like flashcards. And so I'm going to go through it the first time and see if I know the answers. And each time I do it, I'm practicing for what's going to be on the test. So it says religion was a major part of life in all early civilizations. Each of the civilizations believed in many gods. What is the term for the belief in many gods? Anybody want to answer that?
Polytheistic or polytheism.
All right, polytheism is correct. Military leaders would take over city-states. They would become known as monarchs or kings, pharaohs, whatever you want to put in there. Hereditary lines of kings would be known as dynasties. Around 3000 BC, the scribes in Mesopotamia invented a system of writing to record their business transactions. So one thing that you remember in the notes, it said they wrote on moist clay tablets with a stylus. Every time I think about a stylus, I think about a DS Lite. Because a DS has, a Nintendo DS has a stylus, you write with it. What do we call this writing? What is the Mesopotamian writing that we just went over?
Hieroglyphics?
That would be Egyptian.
Oh, okay. So it'd be the one starting with the P, right?
I don't know what the P is. You talking about the Phoenicians?
Yes.
They invented the alphabet. So this is cuneiform, okay? Whenever I look at this too, and this is what I like about going over it this way, it gives me a good picture of what cuneiform looks like in case I have to see it. It's wedge-shaped writing. So when I look at that, I can go, well, it's on a clay tablet. Sumerians created it. It has to be cuneiform. And if I miss it, I can go back later and go over the same question again, okay? By bringing people together, by bringing together the peoples and nations of northern and southern Mesopotamia, Sargon created the world's first empire. All right, and then what is an empire? Several people from different lands, nations, previous independent states under control of one ruler. So as you go through this, it helps you to learn it because it's like flashcards. You're answering it in your head and you're just saying, well, this is the answer. And if it's wrong, you go back. So Babylonian Empire would emerge from Mesopotamia. The first king of Babylonian Empire inscribed laws on 8-foot tall stone tablets and placed them throughout the empire. Who was this? Anybody want to take a guess at that?
Abraham.
Abraham is the founder of Judaism. He didn't come up with a law code. We said, who came up with a law code? Eye for an eye.
Oh, Harambe. Or like,
that's right.
Yeah.
Harambe was the gorilla, but Hammurabi, you're right. Hammurabi is the king that came up with the law code. What were his law codes known as? Hammurabi's code. And there you see the pillar over here to the right, that large pillar that has all the laws on there. Important idea of law that came from Hammurabi's code was eye for an eye. So as you go through this, like this one, this river flowed through the Egyptian civilization. Anybody want to guess at that?
Nile.
The Nile River. And so you see that right there, and it really is just like flashcards. So when you see that assignment on Tuesday, and I'm going to unlock those assignments today, you will see that this is what I want you to do first, and then you take the test on Wednesday, I think. So, you know, you study for the test, and then you take the test, and it shouldn't be that difficult. All right. Any questions?